Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. European Parliament elections are set to take place next month between the 6th and 9th of June. It's the first election since the UK completed its Brexit in 2020. Voters will choose 720 members of the Parliament who will represent the interests of around 400 million Europeans. Those elected will play a crucial role in shaping EU legislation and policies for the next 5 years. In the midst of campaigning, the European Commission is set to launch formal proceedings against Meta for not doing enough to counter misinformation on Facebook and Instagram, a lack of effective monitoring of election content, and inadequate mechanisms for flagging illegal content. We polled our journalist fellows to ask, how much of a problem do you think misinformation will be in the EU parliamentary elections? 67% said a very significant problem. 11% said no more of a problem than usual. 22% were unsure. Joining us today is disinformation expert Peter Pomerantsev, whose new book tells the story of Sefton Delmer, a 1930s political warfare executive who decided to fight Nazi disinformation with an influence campaign of his own. We'll discuss the historic role of misinformation in European politics, the complicity of social media in 2024, the future of information warfare, and lessons for the world in a bumper election year. That's The Briefing. Let's begin. Hello and welcome back to the Global Journalism Seminars, where we're very lucky to be able to grab Peter Pomerantsev for an hour to discuss his new book in the context of the upcoming EU parliamentary elections. Peter was born in Kyiv, grew up in the UK, and is a journalist, author of 3 books with a keen understanding of the modern dynamics of information warfare. Peter's also a senior fellow at the Institute of Global Affairs at LSE and co-director of the Arena Initiative, I should say. Peter, welcome. You're still on mute.
Sorry, just wanted a quick fact check there. I haven't been at the LSE for many years. I'm at Johns Hopkins University, which is why I'm here with you bright and early at 8 a.m. in DC.
Oh, God bless you for getting up early for us. Thank you so much.
That's fine. That's fine. Just wanted to, as the topic is, disinformation and misinformation.
Yes, it is only fitting that I would start the entire thing with some disinformation. Peter, let's start by asking, this isn't your first book on disinformation, or misinformation. It seems to be a theme of your career. Can you tell us, were there personal experiences that led to this focus in your career?
So I misspent my youth in Moscow. I lived there I went there after university. I spent there 2001, 2010. And I wrote my first book about seeing this new kind of propaganda emerge that didn't just lie. I mean, let's be honest, propaganda or propaganda has, political propaganda has always had many untruths, but actually celebrated the fact that truth doesn't exist. So my first book was called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which tried to capture this kind of moment where leaders didn't seem to care if they were caught out lying. And they reveled in the idea that there was no such thing as truth, and that truth could be, everything could be doubted. And in that sort of cynical expanse, all that mattered was a strongman leader to lead you through this sort of wasteland of information and wasteland of values. And it turned out to be quite a prescient book. I mean, I saw that happening in Russia, and then obviously, you had the whole phenomenon of these sort of what some called post-truth politicians. So, I saw it emerge in Russia. I then followed it around the world for my second book, This Is Not Propaganda, which was one of these kind of around the world in 20 disinformation campaigns kind of books.
Best book cover, by the way.
Yeah, I looked at the Philippines, I looked at Mexico, all across the world. And obviously Trump was, an ever-present fixture. But my third book is looking at it in history and what we can do about it. And because people are always asking me, what do we do? What do we do? And we'll talk about that today. And frankly, a lot of the answers are interesting to us. They're about, the Digital Service Act and, the technical revision of the online space and all these kind of really very, very nerdy questions, which I'm sure we're all into, but are hard to get people enthusiastic about. And so I went into history and I looked at sort of like some fun campaigns, or one fun campaign from the past to undermine Nazi propaganda and what we can learn from that. That book had just come out. It came out last month.
Yeah. So this is the Sefton Delmers story, and it's how to win an information war. What do you think we should take from Sefton Delmers' approach? Does it hold up to modern information warfare?
So I think Sefton Delmer is incredibly contemporary, which is why I wrote the book. I mean, so just to be clear, Sefton Delmer worked for the British Political Warfare Executive, which was the British kind of like information agency during the Second World War, which had everything. The BBC was part of it, through to what Delmer did, which was various types of subversion, really. So Delmer ran dozens of radio stations, so kind of like, you know, a sort of covert reflection of the BBC, but these hidden radio stations based out in the English countryside in Bedfordshire, and which basically, you know, pretended to be Nazi stations. Yeah, they were aimed at people in Germany and in occupied Europe, so they'd pretend to be Nazi stations while actually subverting the Nazis. So in a sense, he was doing disinformation. A lot like Russia today will, or the Russian state today will set up, I don't know, Twitter handles in America or in Europe, pretending to be American or French or British or German, when actually they're Russian, seeding the information that they need. But what was interesting about his campaign was, A, how successful it was. Something like half German soldiers were listening to these stations. But also, as I got more and more into it, I realized that they weren't actually deceptive. So the Germans were meant to understand this was the British dressed up as the Germans.
Right.
Because it's a safer way to listen to this. He was giving his audiences physical cover. And here's where I get interesting, psychological cover. Basically, it worked out that as long as you would say things like, you Germans should listen to us, it didn't really work. If you presented things as we Germans, even though people knew perfectly well it was the British, that changed people's psychological attitude. And that's, you know, that starts to get at the root of what he was doing. He basically understood that propaganda in its widest definition, yeah, as any kind of mass influence, with, you know, in many sense, media just being a subset of propaganda in that sense, is all about identity. Yeah. At the most, it's about creating group identity. So he wanted to create an identity that was an alternative to the folk. But it's also about what Freud would call identification. Yeah, the emotional identification you have with the messenger and the leader. So Nazi propaganda was all about you feeling as one with the Nazi folk and having this sort of like identification molding with Hitler. And in that sense, the nastier, the more vile, the more narcissistic the leaders were, the more you could express that in yourself. Yeah. We follow narcissistic leaders because they allow us to be narcissists. That was kind of Delmer's insight. And I mean, he's not the only one who says that, obviously. Freud says this, and Adorno and many others. And he was like, okay, I'm going to play inside this field. And he created kind of alternative hosts who would, you know, most of them from the German cabaret scene, actually. It was stuffed full of people from the anti-Nazi cabaret scene, who would be cosplaying Nazis with this incredibly emotional, often pornographic content. His aim was to kind of capture these emotions, but then kind of displace them. He was doing something along what Brecht would call Entfremdung technique, where he was taking a lot of the language of the Nazis, a lot of the strong feelings of the Nazis, but then exaggerating and twisting them to an extent where you were meant to feel a distance from them. And that was to break the emotional hold that Nazi propaganda had on people, to create a space between you and your identification with the Nazi group. And in that space, you can start communicating with people differently. And there he would start giving people very genuine information. So he did incredible research, much better than the BBC, about the daily lives of soldiers. We can go into how he got that, but it was a huge research exercise. He would start giving them information that was more useful to them and more relevant to their lives than what the Nazis gave them. he would report on air raids way before the Nazis could, because the RAF was giving him the information. So he became a vital source of information. It was about information at the end of the day. And then by giving them that information and selecting the information that really mattered, he was trying to get people to defect, to disobey Nazi orders, to just fake illness, a whole bunch of things to kind of undermine the Nazi war machine. But why I found him fascinating was before you get to that point, he realized you had to crack the collective identity that the Nazis had formed and the identification with the leaders that the Nazis had achieved. And him doing that through really techniques which are much closer to the arts than to media, I think. And again, I keep on saying he had lots of people around him who were novelists, writers, psychoanalysts, who thought very deeply about how you do that. And is so relevant today. I mean, I live in America. I mean, people keep on saying, why do people believe in Trump? He never fulfills any of his policies. It's like, it's not about that. The MAGA world gives you a community, or the sense of a community, and it gives you a performance where you can express, frankly, some of your most vile emotions in a legitimate way. People keep on saying, oh, Trump is so horrible. Why do people like him? That's why they like him. There's a great Adam Sewer essay in The Atlantic about the cruelty is the point. You get to express these pent-up feelings and legitimize them and have a role through which to play them out. And Delma's genius was really understanding that. He'd seen the rise of the Nazis. He was a reporter in Nazi Germany. He got very close to the Nazi elites. He really saw them as a very, very effective cabaret act, and which gave great satisfaction to its followers. And by understanding that relationship, he would try to think of interventions within it. So I find him incredibly contemporary. He would have loved social media, and social media, everybody's performing. It's very clear that we're all performing our individualities, but performing our political individualities. I mean, you can literally track online how people grow more and more extreme as they join an online mob. I mean, we express ourselves through emoticons, which are almost like Grecian masks, filtering a certain set of often very, very aggressive feelings. So Delma would have had a field day in the social media space and thought about what to do about it. So I find him incredibly contemporary, even though in many of his other views, he was a man of the 19th century, let alone the 20th century.
So, Peter, it sounds a little bit like satire. Is that?
Yes, it's close. It's not quite. So the BBC was doing satire. So satire is very aggressive. Satire is basically attacking you. And satire attacks the leader. And satire attacks the follower. So satire is very good at defeating fear. If you've got a bunch of liberals who are trying to stand up to a dictator and they're petrified of him, satire is great. And they can, make him smaller and they can react stupidly. So it's a good tactic in these kind of things. But if you want to intervene in the relationship between a leader and his followers, telling the followers they're morons is not a good approach. And I like watching John Oliver or Jon Stewart. I don't think they're doing much to disrupt the relationship between Trump and his followers.
Right.
So satire makes us feel good. I don't think it does much of a job in intervening. So Delma's doing a psychological disruption exercise. So what he's doing is not. What he's doing, actually, his shows weren't quite satire. They were meant to feel quite real, but he called it pushing Nazi propaganda very gently into the ridiculous, where it starts to subvert itself. Yeah. So you're kind of going along with it and then going, hold on, this is a bit weird. How does this work? A very good, I think, parallel recently, if you want an example of it, is, I don't know how many of you guys watched one of the candidates to be Trump's Veep, to be his vice president, which is the senator for Alabama, I think. Anyway, she did the response to Biden's State of the Union address. And this was her audition to be Trump's VP. So you have Biden's speech came on, and then she came on to talk. And it was a recorded thing. And she was sitting in a kitchen, and she did the whole MAGA spiel about how the world is in danger and how Biden is leading us to, I don't know, carnage, and how we need Trump to save it. But without meaning to, she overplayed it.
Yeah.
And by slightly overplaying it, she brought out its absurdities. And it was very interesting watching the MAGA people, the MAGA commentators, watching her because they had a complete meltdown. They were like, "What
Yeah.
is this?
Yeah.
What the hell is this?"
Yeah.
She wasn't doing satire. She was undermining it by slightly overplaying it to the point where it revealed its own absurdity and it gives you like this shock. That's what I think Delmo was going for. He was going for that in ways that, he'd have these kind of like, there's also like simple ways, he'd have sort of these hosts on who are these sort of rabid far right, or, they're actually German Jews, but playing these rabid far right German soldiers, basically saying, everybody's a secret communist. Goebbels is a secret communist. Himmler's a secret communist, sort of pushing the logic of Nazi propaganda to the point where it's not quite satire, but it's sort of like, the cogs of the logic are starting to hit each other and explode. But it was also a tonal thing as well. How do you say it in a way that isn't satire, but just makes people go, whoa, that really is a bit too much.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very subtle game. Again, he doesn't talk. So Delmo was living in Berlin during the high point of Bertolt Brecht, who was a very, very famous theater director who was trying very similar things in theater. He would take aspects of what he thought was sort of the ruling ideology and exaggerate it to the point where it starts to undermine itself, where you have a distance from it, what he called Entfremdungstechnique. So that's what he was going for. It's a bit more subtle than satire, but not a million. It's kind of on the way to satire. It's like the genius of somebody who you don't know if they're taking the piss or not. It's that sort of thing. Are you taking the piss? Are you? I'm not sure. It's that kind of complicated space that he was working on.
How would you Delmarize a campaign? How would you Delmarize QAnon?
So look, Delma was his aim was to peel away. His aim was to crack the Nazi folk. So the Nazis were trying to create a new common identity, a new idea of the people. And his goal was to kind of peel off the people who were drawn to this for many reasons, sociologically, psychologically, but weren't actually hardcore Nazi party members. So he was actually saying the Nazi party is your enemy. Just like Navalny makes, the Russian sort of opposition leader who was recently demised in a Russian gulag, he tried to sort of create this wedge between Putin's ruling party and ordinary Russians. So Delma probably wouldn't have been going to the QAnons. He's actually,
government
they're far too far gone. Yeah.
Okay.
But he didn't aim for Hitler either, because he thought the bond with Hitler was too tight. He only starts really attacking Hitler in 1944. So if Delma was doing MAGA now, I think he'd be going for the Sons. He'd be saying the Sons. My sense is that I don't know. We need to do some research, but I'd love to know how many Republicans drawn to the MAGA fervor, how they feel about Trump's sons and stuff like that. I mean, I think if Delmo were around today, he'd be thinking about that, or Rick Grinnell, or he's got Kash Patel, these kind of weird people in the movement. So he'd probably be really focusing on them. But in terms of the sort of radios he'd be setting up, I know David Aranovich wrote a review of my book where he was full of good suggestions. A radio station. I mean, I would work very, very intensely with evangelicals. I think there are splits within the evangelical community. I don't think it's a monolith the way that some think. I think you would think about that community. I mean, Dad was always thinking about alternative sources of loyalty. What are the other things that people that act as communal groups for people? I think he'd be thinking about that. I think you'd be thinking a lot about this kind of the working class that Trump is trying to capture, but where there are clear economic sort of differences between them and the leadership. So I think there's lots. I mean, you'd start off with that. You'd think about, okay, what is the sort of, where's the fissure, and then you'd invest your efforts into that.
Obviously, it's very tempting to keep discussing MAGA in
Yes,
the
of
US,
course.
but we are meant to be talking about the EU. So
Let's talk about the EU.
there are some very strong parallels there, maybe perhaps not as clearly, perhaps not as overt as the US, but there's definitely stuff happening. Let's start off with Meta and the European Commission launching proceedings. What further measures would you recommend for social media platforms to implement?
Well, I mean, look, it's all about, firstly, the DSA is a big step forward, and the European parliamentary elections are a huge test about how it's going to work in practice. It's not even fully built yet, the Digital Services Act. There's this enforcement team under this wonderful French guy whose name I've just forgotten, but who I've been reading up on. So look, this is a real trial, and also working with civil society. You're going to have to be doing a lot of the reporting on it. So look, this is a trial, so we'll see how it works. But we know what we want. We want transparency, and when do we want it? Soon, in time for June 11th. But so it's all about transparency. We'll see how the different companies play along. The problem child is seen as Twitter rather than Facebook so much. That's the big test. The looming battle seems to be between, well, what was known as Twitter and the DSA. But I always come at this with a very sort of, how do we apply very, very core elements of democratic norms in what is obviously a very complicated space. And I always come back to, what are my rights as a citizen under freedom of expression? Because they use freedom of expression as their defense, or non-liability as their defense. But I should have the right to understand who is manipulating me and how. Why is the algorithm showing me one thing and not another? Who is behind the campaigns that I see? How much have they spent? Are they showing the same content to somebody else, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, Meta obviously have said they're going to have less political content, but what does that really mean? What are the boundaries of political and non-political content? It's very, very hard to know. I mean, I think there is a slight problem that we're reducing political campaigns to like party political campaigns in the lead up to an election, when these things are formed well in advance and through proxies and through movements. So I don't think just limiting it to, an ad campaign the week before the election is really enough regulatory transparency. So that's what we need to get to, and hopefully we'll be able to. However bad it is, it's a lot better than where I am in the US, where things are actually going backwards. So however much we might complain about, the slowness of Brussels regulation, it feels like, the promised land compared to the US, where things are actually going backwards.
Are you aware of any particularly effective misinformation campaigns that are playing out right now?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Look, there's a lot of news about, various Russian campaigns, in America, increased Chinese campaigns. There's obviously a huge amount about the war in Gaza. Without getting into the horror and the obvious war crimes that are happening there, it's obviously a field day for a state like Russia, which can play both sides, pump out anti-Semitic content, which the French have caught them doing that, and at the same time, sort of directing a lot of content to support the other side as well, support far right movements, support nationalist movements. So if you're Russia and you're just looking at, the really quite understandable tensions around the war in Gaza, I mean, it's a field day for exacerbating things in the way that you want. But I think, I think that's an obvious hot topic.
Think Gaza would be used as a tool of dissuasion in the EU campaigns?
Well, it's going to help. It can help both sides, but it can help especially sort of far right movements. Especially in Germany and Holland. You use the sort of like you know, you use the threat. Basically, you use anti-Muslim campaigns to boost the far right in Germany and other countries.
And I think I think it was you who said this in a seminar about the "This is not propaganda" findings, that it's not about necessarily persuading people to an ideology that's useful for you. It's about breeding chaos. So it's, as long as you can get people disagreeing, this is the aim.
Yeah, I mean, disagreements is fine. I mean, disagreement is good. That's part of democracy. But yes, I mean, it can be ideologically agnostic. I mean, your aims are to cause. I mean, it's not just disagreement for the sake of disagreement. It's you know, the sort of extreme breakdown in sort of in political dialogue that you see in the US, maybe, but also it's to undermine people's faith in elections. It can be to boost the party. I mean, like, you know, it's a full spectrum of aims, but it's very ideologically fluid. You know, it can be far left when it needs to be, far right when it needs to be. It can just exacerbate tensions when that needs to happen. I mean, it's very, very fluid. I mean, it's not about promoting one party or one line. But you know, in terms of the EU elections, I mean, obviously Russia's aim is to get as many parties that want to promote peace in Ukraine into parliament. So they have a very tactical aim as well right now.
I'm going to come to audience questions in a second, so please do use the Q&A feature and pop them in. But before we switch over, perhaps the one question left that I would like to touch on is AI in this specific EU campaign or parliamentary election process. How are you picturing AI's role in disinformation going forward? I know it might be a bit too early to say this is it, but perhaps
there's a huge amount of speculation at the moment. We're very much, I mean, there's people are worried about deep fakes. People are worried about the ability to, I think this might be a more sort of, you know, more accurate fear. You know, let's say you put out a campaign of some sort, you could then use AI to game the Google algorithm much quicker. You know, that's always the challenge. It's getting stuff out there is really easy. It's getting it, you know, high up the Google feed.
Eyeballs. Yeah.
So you can do that with AI techniques just a lot more effectively. You know, you don't have to hire thousands of people in a click farm or something. You can, you know, just generate so much activity around certain stories. It'll climb the Google algorithm. So I think that's a more grounded fear in the sense that we could really, you know, you could imagine how that would happen and would work. I think generally, though, look, the technology is always evolving. All sides have access to the technology. It's not really about the technology. It's about the plan, and it's about understanding the vulnerabilities of the ecosystem. So let's go back to 2016 and the Russian campaign in America, simply because that's the best research campaign we have. And there's two campaigns, essentially. There's one, which is a big social media campaign, getting lots and lots of pro-Trump, anti-Hillary content on Facebook and Twitter. That's the one that gets a lot of attention. We frankly don't know if that had any effect. I mean, I mean, the volumes were kind of impressive, and the content was amusing. But do you really change anybody's mind at that point in an election in social media communities that are already dedicated to a certain cause? Unclear. I'm really unclear whether that moved anything. The other campaign, which is done by a different part of the Russian secret services, is very different. It's hacking into the Democratic National Convention, taking a bunch of emails that are actually have nothing in them that's criminal, giving them to Julian Assange, who is a highly trusted source, who then drips them out in such a way they feel corrupt, they feel there's something dodgy, and then that's taken up by the New York Times, CBS, NBC, and used in the debates. So the intervention there technologically is a hack, like really old school. And it's how you deliver that into the ecosystem and how the ecosystem then makes a huge deal out of it.
So it's the psychology, not the technology.
It's the strategy, it's the plan, you know, especially if you're a foreign power where you don't have you don't have a bullhorn, you know, you don't have and you don't have MSNBC or something. So it's all about understanding the ecology and making the intervention that will, I don't know, play out in it. So the, you know, in many ways, the bots and the trolls on social media at that point were more sophisticated technologically than a hack. But it's not, it's a hack. It's whatever you want to call Julian Assange at that moment. It's sort of agent of influence, or I don't want to get into the Assange debate, but somebody who's very interesting, somebody who will listen to you and work with you, but who's also trusted by Western media. And understanding, and then, you know, the main responsibility is with American media, who lap this up, completely swallow it, don't care where it's come from, and do the Kremlin's work for it. So that is a much more successful intervention than the, you know, at the time, technologically ambitious social media campaign.
I'm going to go to a question from Leah from CMAS. She asks, you mentioned Delmer extrapolated Nazi communication to the point where it became absurd and made the whole thing meaningless. Goebbels is a communist spy. This reminded me of your take on facts becoming arbitrary or meaningless in current Russia. Do you see parallels between these dynamics, or is your take on Delmer more about ridiculing to diffuse a take instead of rendering words meaningless in general?
Wow, somebody who's read a lot of me. So listen, he's trying to get to the point where words can have meaning again. But what he understands is that the identity grip of the Nazis is so strong, people are in a space where facts don't matter. And obviously there's been, you know, a lot of writing about this. Hannah Arendt writes about it. And the title of my first book was actually an unconscious misquote of Hannah Arendt. But she's basically saying in these kind of environments, facts don't matter anymore. It's all about identity. It's all about your relationship to the leader, marking who you are. It's not an evidence-driven debate. Delmer's aim is to rupture that identity, rupture that emotional bond people have with the community and the leader to a place where facts can start mattering again. So he does want to get us back to quite a classic place where you have agency, where you're thinking critically, where facts matter. But he understands that to get to there, you have to intervene in this relationship first. Yeah, it's, I mean, again, kind of over ambitious, but it's a little bit like a cult deprogramming thing where you first have to intervene in that relationship, and then you start going, well, I mean, have you noticed what's happened to your bank account the last 10 years? Where did all the money go? But if you, and you gave it all to the cult, but if you start with that, it'll never work. So the Delmer exercise is, how do you get people to the point where facts can start mattering again? But he was also very aware that it's going to be the facts that matter to people. So he did a huge amount of research, really quite remarkable ways. So I'll give you one thing. I mean, the British, and I'm not saying we should imitate this, I'm just saying the extent to which they went to get facts. The British were getting an information stream from partisan movements who would tell them little things like, what was the score in the latest football game between different army divisions? Yeah, so they could give commentary about the football in the, you know, games between different bits of the army. That's sort of easy stuff. Like, what is the new car that the corrupt officer who runs the sort of stormtrooper brigade in Koblenz riding? You know, what is the food that was at the rather lush party that Goebbels' daughter had? All this sort of detail. Then they had secret microphones, and I'm not saying we should imitate this, but in all the POW camps that were recording all the conversations of German POWs. I don't know if that's in breach of the Geneva Conventions. I don't know. Listening to all their conversations, and through that, getting the latest rumors about what people thought about their commanding officers, getting their latest jokes, their latest language. So this incredible exercise in understanding the world of the audience. And they had mathematicians from Oxbridge working with Delmer, who had worked out when German submarine staff, sailors, would get a prize, like from the Navy. And they worked out that they would get them after their boats had sunk a certain amount of tons of British ships. So they would know exactly how many tons each submarine had sunk. And because the British knew first when they'd sunk the next boat, because it was a British boat, they were able to report congratulations to these sailors saying, well done, you're next in line for an award, before the Nazis had even reported it. So they were getting news to people before the Nazis could. So at the end of the day, it was actually an information gathering and information delivery exercise, which went through huge amounts of research to be relevant to people, and never talked down to them. But in order to get there, you had to do all this kind of work with people's feelings first.
I'm going to paraphrase a question from Marissa, who essentially says it's all very well to come up with an effective strategy like this when you're dealing with a small population, but how does it differ when you're dealing with a massive population like India, or in the case of this seminar, multiple different cultures across Europe? How does the strategy change then?
I mean, so Delma was doing stations for the whole of occupied Europe, so everything from France to the Black Sea. So I don't really understand the question. I mean, you understand
for
your
example, would his radio station for France be different to his radio station for?
Well, I think they had 5 or 6 for France. No, you have completely different ones. You think about different audiences. You segment. You do.
Yeah.
It's much easier today. You segment and you target. I mean,
yeah.
Do you
think that's possible in a place like India?
I'm not an expert in India, but I mean, if you break it down, I mean, when I talk to Indian journalists, they're like, in India, you've got to break it down by state. Do the one for the, But I think it's much easier today to segment, break down is much easier. Targeting is much easier today. So again, it's much simpler, and it's cheaper. So what remains is the challenge of understanding your audience. Delmo was also kind of clever. It's like, even when he did a station for there was ostensibly an armed services station, which was his most popular one. He knew it was done in such a way that it would be interesting for the people back home as well. So his idea was that people back home, as in like in the interior of Germany, would be interested in what's going on to the soldiers. Very similar with Russia about what happened with Prigozhin, who was this sort of like mercenary leader who was trying to lead a rebellion in the army until last year. He was hugely popular with people who were actually against the war and were actually quite liberal inside of Russia, because they were fascinated to find out the rumors and the conflicts within the army. So Delmar also understood that you could, even though you were doing it about the army, this would be interesting to other people as well. So he was quite sophisticated in understanding that. But overall, no, he had stations for soldiers in Norway. He had stations for Catholics. He had stations for SS people. In France, I think there were several. There was one aimed at Catholics. There was one aimed at the working class. There was one aimed at the bourgeoisie. There was one aimed at Gaullists. So no, you
segment. Got it.
And you have to. That's just the way the audiences are. But I think that's simpler today. I don't think that's harder. It's much simpler today.
It is simpler today. And it is kind of the very first step of, if you're going to be deploying a strategy that's about building relationship, you need to know who you're building a relationship with. So I guess that is pretty... Okay. Stefan from EFCSN says, did you read the piece by Bela Golovi, Don't Hype the Disinformation Threat? It recently published in Foreign Affairs. And what are your thoughts on it if you did? But more generally speaking, are we overestimating Russian disinformation and underestimating domestic mis or disinformation?
I don't know who the we is, because overall in the community that I'm in, which is kind of the academic one, it's always been about poo-pooing the effects of propaganda, and it has been since the 1940s, 1950s. So, there was a huge, so in the academic debate, it's always like, oh, but do you really know what the effect is? And you have very brave people like Catherine Hall Jameson, who's head of Annenberg Political Communication School, who try to prove some of the impacts. So overall, I don't know which, are you talking about Gavin Wild's piece and Olga Belagalova? Ah, that was your, yes, they're very good friends of mine, and I'm at Hopkins with Olga. So look, they're practitioners and academics, and they're reflecting the kind of classic position in both the bureaucracy and academia, which is like, go prove to me that it works. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. So I don't know who the we is. I mean, in general, media and comms has been trying to work out whether violent people make movies violent for 70 years. And the academic conclusion has been sometimes maybe for a bit. So if you're looking for like the proof in the community that I'm in, it's a sort of eye roll. The question what we can talk about politically is intent. You know, what do they want to do? What are they trying to do? And the intent is clearly there. The success of it, very hard to measure. Also, we don't know everything. Also, the Russians don't think about it as disinformation, think about it as information psychological operations, which span corruption, buying individual politicians, the influence of companies, of banks, of what we call PD. I mean, I think our great lack when we approach this as a field is that we like to segment it in, here's disinformation, here's strategic communication, here's financial influence. That is an absurd way to look at the world. And the only critique I'd have of Olga and Gavin's approach, even though like these are my friends and colleagues, just to be clear, was their background. So Olga's background, she was head of threats at Facebook. So she was looking at tiny little thing. Gavin's looking at it as a bureaucrat. He was at the NSC, again, trying to narrow what this is. The Russians aren't doing it that way. The Russians see it as influence. The Russians see it as policy. And they see it as one thing, because it is one thing for them. It's one guy from the Kremlin coordinating all this on his telephone. While we're trying to parcel it into the language of Western bureaucracy. So I actually think we have a language to make sense of what they're doing. Yeah. So the closest that we've come is Neville Bolt at King's College London, who created this whole field of strategic communication, trying to explain strategic communication not as disinformation campaigns, but as the informational component of all policy. Think about of all policy, yeah, economic, cultural, financial, military, as having a perception aim. But Neville hasn't been able to make that into the logic of the state. That's the only academic who's tried to think about it. And when I saw that, I was like, you kind of get how Russians approach this. So we have this mismatch between the conceptual language. You just use this word disinformation. I mean, no one uses that term in Russia. Disinformation is like a tiny little thing that one little tiny department of the KGB used to do in the Cold War. I mean, it's a tiny thing. The idea that that is the essence of what they do speaks to our lack of understanding of their idea of statecraft. And frankly, that's why we're losing. They see perception as the end goal of everything. Yeah. While we see it as something that in America, the undersecretary unfilled of position of public diplomacy should do. It wasn't like that in the Cold War. You know, in the Cold War, we did think about this as a cohesive thing, but we've completely lost the kind of the bureaucratic logic to do that through.
I like the term malign influence campaign. Is it closer?
But it's still campaigns. We're still thinking of like, you know, these itsy bitsy little campaigns, which is fine.
It's a lifestyle.
They are a thing, but like, that's just not how the only time we start to think about this is during military operations. When we start to think of perception as part of the military operation. But the Russians are doing that in their statecraft all the time.
Right. So just to circle this back to journalism for a second, I think it's fair to say that obviously journalists should not be Dulmerizing anything. That would be it would be great for them to contribute research and factual information, but probably to go as far as Dulmerizing would be not journalism.
Definitely not. And he wouldn't think it was journalism either, by the way.
But what role why is it useful for journalists to understand this information? And B, what role do journalists play in this kind of approach to relationship-based information interventions?
So look, journalism has often reinvented itself over the centuries. It reinvents itself over and over. And I think now is one of those moments when it's thinking about its reinvention. And you can see that happening on the ground. You can see the BBC going, okay, part of our mission now is to counter disinformation. I think that's fine. I mean, I think why, which is great, why you have things like the Reuters Institute is a chance for journalists to retreat from the everyday war of journalism, which is often about survival, frankly. And actually things like, what is our theory of change? Where do we fit into the logic of democracy? I'm in America, where there's this huge debate going on. Should journalists be even-handed about this upcoming election, or is it journalists' job to defend democracy? Because without democracy, there ain't no journalism. I think we do have to question our theory of change, because I think it has been, on a default, relying on frankly mythical concepts about the marketplace of ideas. We get information out there, and that'll somehow help democracy to be better. I mean, will it? Are we sure? In an age of and here I think it is right to use the term disinformation, which is just churned out there, is producing a bit of truth going to compete? Yeah. In an age where the structure of media has changed so much, where there is no clear public space where these ideas are contested, with a political space, they're not contested, they were. Is that what we do? Do we just put information out there, and there's some sort of weird amorphous theory that will guide a better democracy? I think we need to examine those things. What do we, a lot of us, and I'm still partly, at least 1/3 of me is still a journalist, and maybe not more, but at least 1/3 is. But when we talk about speaking truth to power, what do we do when the powerful don't care about the truth? I mean, investigative journalism is still the essence, or it's like the hardcore part of journalism, without a doubt. And we do see investigations changing things at huge personal costs to the journalist. So I am not poo-pooing investigative journalism even for a moment. I think it's the most bravest and the most heroic part of journalism. But we have all these instances where it has, especially in a lot of authoritarian regimes, but also in democracies, where you find out the truth, you find out the corruption of a political leader, and everybody just goes, so what? Everyone's corrupt. What do we do about that? Is that our role to think about those things as well? So I do think we need a space to think about those things. And we need to have a space where we think about what is our role in the design of the public sphere and the design of tech platforms. Should we be, if that is the fundamental issue that is undermining the theory of democracy we had and the role of information within it, what is our role in that debate as well? Should we be taking money from tech companies too? So all those questions need to be asked very, very concretely, and I'm very glad that there are places like the Reuters School that offer that opportunity. I do think we're going through a period of making sense of what is our role in the larger relationship between information and democracy.
As I'm listening to you talk, it reminds me of a former fellow, Rebecca Skippage, who
I know.
Her main finding was, maybe we need to fight fire with fire, and that's not very far off a Dulmerization of technique. Let me go downstairs to the room where Rebecca from New Zealand has a question for you. Go for it, Rebecca.
Thanks. Thank you very much. This is super interesting, especially as a science journalist. We learned very early in the pandemic that facts don't change people's minds, and it became really confusing to figure out how to communicate when you wanted to get across information that might literally save people's lives, but people were in some cases not interested in hearing it. And I wanted to go back to your point that Seth Dundalma would have loved social media, and I wondered if you could talk more about what he would have done on social media with these giant transnational misinformation. I don't even know whether to call them campaigns, because I don't know who's running them, whether that's to do with vaccine misinformation was such a big one, but now we're getting this deluge of anti-trans misinformation that just seems to be popping up and infecting people in different countries via social media. I wonder what he would have done in those instances if he was fighting those.
So, Look, Delmer was working. I mean, he's not starting from a pure journalistic position. He's starting from a position of how can we win. His aim is he's not starting from like, his question is how do we disrupt the other side's propaganda? I mean, that's really what he's about. So he would be thinking about the relationships between, I don't know, the leading anti-vaxxers and people, and why is that connection there? And it might have nothing to do with vaccines, by the way. Just the way we saw those communities evolve, they were into one thing, then another one. I mean, they didn't really seem to be about science, frankly. And if the aim was to get people to take vaccines, if that's the aim, you think about how do you intervene in those relationships, and you'd work out why people might be skeptical. I mean, on the vaccines bit, I mean, there is a bit of research. I mean, I don't think we should always. I'm not sure Delmer is our guy for the vaccine stuff, frankly. But we did quite a lot of research at Hopkins and the LSE about that, and we were looking at Eastern Europe. Why are people not taking vaccines among Russian-speaking communities in Estonia, for example? And it turned out, again, so this is quite Delmer. I mean, there were people who are conspiratorial nut jobs. I don't mean the word nut job, sorry. There are people who are really into conspiracies. You're not going to get to them, There are a lot more people who were, it was actually with Chernobyl. They'd have a horrible Soviet experience with the state and medical issues. Yeah, a lot of them remember Chernobyl, and they felt the state was something that brought them sickness, frankly. Some of them may have had a bad experience with Soviet vaccines. A lot of them were really into kind of like organic health as a consequence. There's a lot of that in that bit of the world, actually. A lot of it to do with Chernobyl. There's a bit of the world that was really, really got very, very sick because of what happened and weren't told the truth. Still huge amounts of children's cancer in Belarus, for example. So you've got to do that. You've got to realize that they don't trust the state when it comes to medicine. And you've got to think about, okay, who might be the other deliverers of information. We had a similar problem here in Baltimore at Hopkins. So Hopkins is a huge medical university and was doing a lot of information about vaccines for the whole world. Had a real problem in Baltimore itself, where there's a very, very large Afro-American population that wasn't taking the vaccines. And when they started doing social research, they worked out it was because of the legacy of Johns Hopkins University, goes all the way back to the 19th century, using the local population to experiment on. And there's this poisonous relationship between town and gown. I mean, there's bad relationships between town and gown in Oxford. In Baltimore, it's a different level, because in Baltimore, like the university and the hospital used the local population to do medical experiments on without telling them. It was all quite, it's pretty dark. And there was this incredible lack of trust, and so Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Medical School, which are this source of absolute trust for the whole world, were not inside Baltimore. And you had to work on those community relationships. So in that sense, look, I am not for one second saying we should cut and paste Delmer, but Delmer would start with those things as well. He'd go, why are the audiences part of this community? What is driving that relationship? How do we set up alternative sources of trust and communication? So yeah, that's what we found in our research anyway, and what Hopkins found in their research in Baltimore.
It sounds, I would maybe add one step before that, which is who is the community we're trying to reach, and what do they get from being part of this community, and then how can we meet that need in a way that creates opportunity to introduce reliable information.
Yeah. So look, if you're talking about what journalists should do from Delmer, it is the audience research. That is the commonality. I mean, Delmer was an audience-driven media. I mean, that was his kind of thing. He was like, the BBC talks down to people and it's trapped in its own liberal bubble. Let us understand the gripes of the soldier, the ambitions of the soldier. Let us understand the frustrations that ordinary Germans, whatever that means, have at the Nazi elites. I think the commonality is the audience-driven piece. Yeah, let us not think that simply preaching or simply spinning the truth out there and hoping it lands, that's not enough. I think in everything else, there's and let us understand the kind of like the extent to which people yearn for community, being understood, being listened to, all those things. Which sounds like, no, that sounds very easy to say, but go do that in a way that then doesn't compromise your journalistic ethics. How do you find the balance between the journalistic mission and what journalists feel comfortable with, or the sort of journalists who come to the Reuters Institute feel comfortable with? Because, you know, plenty of journalists do feel comfortable with that. But you know, how do you find the balance between that?
Yeah. And let me slide in one more EU question before we wrap up. How do you feel about the effectiveness of you have said it's being tested now for the first time, but the effectiveness of the EU's regulatory framework in managing misinformation compared to other global approaches?
So I was quite involved at the start of this sort of the debate in Britain about the online harms.
Mm.
And I know that bill has grown, has become very controversial, but the essence of the approach, that you start by thinking about harms and the responsibility of companies to deal with those harms. I mean, that's definitely a better approach than going after every piece of content, which is what we were doing at the start. So the fact that it's a systems approach, that it's about transparency and oversight, and the sort of
this the UK's harms bill, not the EU.
Frankly, look, I don't think they'd ever admit it, but I actually think the EU took the best bits out of the UK approach and developed them. I'm not sure they'll ever admit that, but they did. But like, again, you'd have to do some journalistic research. So they took the best bits that the Brits introduced, and I think they have, and like the British approach, I think they have kept a political harms component. I can't remember. They definitely do talk about disinformation as a thing, and they do think about political consequences as well. I think I kind of lost track of the debate, to be honest. But so I'm glad to listen to somebody else. But they have, look, they're kind of miles ahead of where we are in the US, which is the only obvious comparison I have at the moment. And it is coming alongside a larger debate within the European Commission, which I think is like bunched around the Project of Enlightenment 2.0, which is very modest. But it is, you know, about this larger question about what is a healthy public sphere, which is the ultimate kind of like philosophical question that we're getting at here.
Right.
Not that we've ever had any kind of perfect one, but what is this environment that we want that's conducive to democracy? And what is the role of regulation within that? So I think we'll find out how effective it is. I think we're going to see some big collisions happening, and then we'll see what can really be done. And will the companies just say, you know, just stick their tongue out, or will they actually comply? Or are we going to have good companies and not so good companies, which I expect will probably happen. So we'll see how it actually plays out. But the philosophy behind it seems to be the right one. I mean, I just wonder if there's somebody else on this call who just knows much more than I do. But definitely when I interviewed Eurova and the DSA was being born and the Democracy Action Plan was emerging, it seemed to be the right framings. I'm very happy to hear from the audience whether there's somebody who goes, no, they're getting it all wrong. But it's
in Oxford, there's always someone on the call who knows more than you do, and that's why
exactly. That's why I'm being very cautious. I read them all at the start. I read them all when the DSA came out and the action plan came out. I haven't revisited them, so I will have to be slightly circumspect in my comments.
Wait and see. Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad to hear from somebody in the audience. I mean, like somebody wants to give me a debrief. I have been very, very focused on the war in Ukraine for the last 2 years.
We have regrettably run out of time, but I will say thank you so much for all of those insights, and for bringing a narrative structure to your thoughts, because I think especially for journalists, it's just so much easier to understand these concepts in a narrative framework through the story of someone like Delmer. So it's been a great hour. I'm very sorry to those of you who I didn't get to your questions, but thank you for coming. And we will see you again next week. We're talking AI interventions in newsrooms. God, aren't we all sick of talking about AI already, and it hasn't even started? But this is actually going to be a very interesting seminar because it's somebody who is working in newsrooms with news organizations on how they handle the transition. So do join us, and thank you, Peter. Go well. And I will see you soon, not at LSE, but at Johns Hopkins.
All right then. Thank you so much.
Go well.